Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, our Market Research Podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today we're joined by Karine Pepin, Senior Vice President at 2CV, an insight solutions market research organization for a complex world. Thanks for joining us on the show again, Karine.
Hi, thanks Michael for having me.
You're welcome. So Karine, what's the most significant thing you're going to tell us today?
I feel like we've hit a wall in terms of data quality by treating sample as a commodity instead of an asset. And changing this mindset is going to take a bit of time, and it's going to have a major impact on the entire ecosystem of research.
It sounds accurate from what we're hearing as well. So I guess first off, for those who might have been living under a rock in recent times, let's touch on the problem and how we're currently trying to deal with it as an industry.
Yeah, so if you've been living under a rock, there's been a lot of discussions about data quality recently, and a lot of initiatives too across multiple organizations in market research. But we're still spending an enormous amount of time and effort and resources on data cleaning. So out of curiosity, I looked at my timesheets last year because I wanted to know how much time I spent on data quality. And it turns out I spent 250 hours. So that is about 6 weeks of my time, which is about 12%. So there's definitely like a price tag associated with poor data quality that we can't quite quantify because it's just kind of spread out in the entire ecosystem. And because it's free to replace bad respondents, it feels like, it's free and there's no problem, but there's definitely a lot of labor involved in doing all these quality checks. So it's not free.
Yeah, we've similar kind of metric that our customers have experienced in terms of speed improvements when they use our platform. And interestingly, they don't often do more projects as a result of that saved back time, but they spend that time to make their projects more valuable, deeper insights, and have more confidence in the insights that they're able to draw and share with their business. So similar kind of situation with data quality. If we can remove some of that, there are wider benefits for our businesses.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So why isn't it enough to directly deal with these issues the way that we currently are?
Well, I think by now everybody has some sort of quality measures, in place. So we have typically fraud detection software that blocks suspicious respondents from entering the survey. Then we have in-survey checks that are automated, like speeding, straight lining, and then we have post-survey checks, some data quality checks that we do after fieldwork. But I was just on LinkedIn and I saw this post from a fraud detection software company. And they were saying that they block about 20 to 25% of the traffic before it even hits the survey. But despite that, we're still removing 10 to 20% of the completes at the end. So it feels like it's a bit of a cat and mouse game in the sense that as we get more sophisticated, the fraudsters also get more sophisticated. So at the end of the day, data cleaning is just a band-aid fix. It's not a real solution to the problem. And there's been a lot of talk about AI, but I've used AI for data cleaning. It does help to automate some of the process, but it still doesn't make the problem go away. This is not the solution. And you'll often hear that there isn't any silver bullet to this crisis. And I agree with this, but I think maybe the solution is not a new tool to fix what we have, but just a different way of doing things, of collecting data. That's thinking a little bit outside the box here, rather than trying to fix what's already in place.
Okay, so we won't keep our audience hanging any longer. So what makes you think that we've been treating sample as a commodity up until now?
Well, with all the automation, it's all led to efficiencies. So it's never been cheaper and faster to collect data. And some people describe this as the race to the bottom. And I think, this can't go on forever. And we've really reached the bottom of that race to the bottom. I think we're forgetting that multi-million-dollar decisions are based solely on participants' self-reported identities and behavior. So basically, these decisions depend on the quality of the sample at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. Now, treating sample as a reliable asset, it sounds, I guess, quite obvious if you think about it. What exactly do you mean by it?
Well, I think what we mean by it sounds really simple, but it's that we need sample that we can trust. And this starts with having faith in the authenticity of the participants. So we've solved this problem on the B2B side with expert networks. So we can recruit over LinkedIn, for example, and we can validate the identity of the doctors, of the engineers we talk to through their profile. So I'm making this maybe more simple than it is, but that's the idea. And when we do this, when we recruit this way, we basically eliminate 99.9% of the data cleaning for two reasons. So first, it's better targeting. And when you target people better, they're more interested in the study. And also with higher incentives, they're more motivated to do well. So we get more thoughtful responses to begin with. But also because we know that these people are who they say they are, we don't need to go all nuts with the data cleaning. What we're trying to do is, a lot of the data cleaning right now is just trying to make sure that we're talking to people who are who they say they are. And if we're confident of that, then we don't expect perfection from anyone. It's fine if the open-ended responses are not the most amazing thing I've ever read, or if they went through the survey a little fast. So it really cuts down on the data cleaning. And so you're going to ask, like, well, then what's the catch, right? Well, because there's always a catch, there's always a trade-off. And in this case is that this type of sample costs a lot more. And field work will be slower. It takes forever. And what else? Like feasibility is going to be lower. But at the end of the day, it's really worth it not to spend 250 hours on data cleaning.
No, that's true. I mean, that just raised an interesting thought in my head as well. If we know who these people are and we have brought them into our panels, have you heard of anyone going back to the respondents to clarify particular questions that may have been light or a bit vague?
Well, I mean, maybe not to this extent, but I do have an example. So for example, I was using this type of recruit, and I was reading their open-ended responses, and I was a little unsure whether this person was the right target. So I went back to the panel company and I asked them, this looks a little weird. And they did go back to the respondent and they did clarify and they did explain why they said what they said. So I don't know that we can scale that to 2,000 people, but it has happened, yes.
I think when you think of the technology available to us and treating panel almost a bit more as a conversation, I think there's possibly some room to explore that for sure.
Yeah.
So what you were just saying before about recruiting, say through social or LinkedIn, for instance, sounds good from a B2B perspective, but how do you see this scaling up from a consumer research point of view?
Well, this is the challenge. In an ideal world, we would want to take this model where we can verify the participants and apply that to consumer research. Now, the problem with consumer research is that the sample sizes that we expect are much larger. So for B2B, typically, we're not going to talk to 2,000 doctors because that's very expensive. That's going to take you a long time. But in consumer research, you want to talk to 2,000 people that have purchased an orange car in the past 3 months because you can, because it's cheap, because it's fast. So there are not a lot of options right now to scale that model. And I think social media, recruiting through Facebook, for example, is an option. And social media has gotten a bad reputation back in the day because it was deemed to be inferior quality to the well-managed double opt-in panels, which was true at the time. But in reality, today, the proportion of these well-managed double opt-in panels is much lower than it used to be. So all of a sudden, social media doesn't sound so bad with the right quality measures in place. And I think one of the advantages of social media is that you're talking to real, I won't say real, but I mean, you're talking to non-professional survey respondents. So I think their behavior might be a little bit more representative of the population. And the other option we have are mobile panels. So I love mobile panels because each respondent is linked to a smartphone. So you can track a lot of information about these people, their behavior, app usage, for example, purchases. So it's a lot less likely that they're going to misrepresent themselves just to qualify for a study, because you know the truth. You know if they've gone to Starbucks, for example. And the other benefit of it is that you can also track their whereabouts. So the cell phone leaves the house sometime. You know that this is not like a smartphone that's like sitting in some building in Bangladesh that's part of a click farm. And it sounds silly, but it's actually really reassuring to be able to know that for sure. And again, once you know that, you don't need to go all crazy with the data cleaning, because you're talking to the person you think you're talking to.
That's true. And people are spending anywhere from 4 to 8 hours a day on their phone. So, they're comfortable responding on that as well. So,
right. Yeah, for sure.
So if we take a step back here, what impact do you think there'd be that would play out on research practices if we as an industry adopted this sample as an asset mindset?
Yeah, I like that, the sample as asset mindset. So I think that, a lot of it will have to change, because we know we can't have fast, cheap, and good. So if we're going to focus more on quality, and we use that example of the B2B validated sources, we know it's going to be more expensive. We know it's going to be lower feasibility. So as a result, each participant is going to be more valuable. It's going to become, an asset, not a commodity. But for that model to be actually viable, we'll have to change some of our research practices. And I don't know if this is going to happen subconsciously or consciously, but I think some of the things we do now are not going to work. We're not going to be able to have like such large sample sizes. We'll have to design surveys that are more engaging, because now we care about the people taking the survey. And I don't want to say shorter necessarily, because you can field, pretty long surveys with people that are interested in the topic and that get the right incentive. If it's not repetitive, it's a good survey. So it's really more about the experience rather than the length. We are going to have to provide higher incentives. And we talked about this almost a year ago, but maybe we think about keeping partial data as well, because if someone completed 90% of a survey and they're difficult to find, then maybe we want to keep them. We don't want to just reject them because they missed 3 questions at the end.
True. So interesting point you made about smaller sample sizes. I was just reflecting on one of my previous podcasts I'd had with John Gerasai on the issue of polls. So political polls as well. His argument to help turn around the inaccuracies of polling was to increase sample size to try and get better representation. And I know that there are 2 different types of surveys, polling and this what we're talking about here, but you can see that there are these differing suggestions on how to fix these issues, and you can understand why progress has been slow to fix. Does this suggest the need that we need to have industry standards?
So I listened to the podcast, and John makes some really good points. he looks at this from a completely different angle, which is focusing on the 95% of the population who doesn't take surveys at all, and reflecting on the non-response bias that this leads to. So it's not, you know, necessarily, I think, increasing sample sizes, but increasing representation. And I think he was giving the example of underrepresenting people that have maybe a little less education, and the impact this has on polling, on political pollings, for example. But I think one of the things he said that's really interesting too is that it hasn't always been this way. And technology has been hurting us, actually, has been hurting research outcome. And he talks about how sampling was so much more systematic with Katie. So I think that's you know, that's interesting to see, like, the changes that happens over time and how we just have to adapt, you know, because of the technology. So anyway, back to your question, to your industry standard. I think we do need more industry standards and more regulations when it comes to sampling. But I think one thing that most importantly we need is more choices. So if we want to buy sample today, you know, there are some choices, but even if you have like all the money in the world to throw at it, you're still pretty limited. You know, it's still mostly traditional online panels for consumer. You don't have a lot of options. And with having someone come in and disrupt that space and providing alternative offering, I think this would create some healthy competition, and at the end of the day, probably improve the quality of the data and the sample.
No, and that's the mecca, isn't it? That's our North Star.
Yeah.
So any final words before I close, Karine?
Well, I think, you know, we just need to remember that data quality is not a sustainable solution. So sure, we can spend a lot of time trying to automate this process with AI, but at the end of the day, what we need is a stronger foundation. We just need better raw ingredients to work with. And sample has been devalued for years at the expense of cost and speed. So this hasn't happened overnight. And I think it's going to take a while to fix that problem too. It might take 10 years if it took us 10 years to get there. And everything is going to change in terms of our research practices based on the sample industry changing. And it will probably happen organically, but we'll need to adjust the sample sizes. We'll need to adjust the budgets, the timeline. It's gonna be a trade-off, and it's gonna have a domino effect on everything else.
I think there's going to be a really interesting dynamic between sample and I guess AI generated insights, if you will. So obviously AI can only be trained on available information to it, and so that anything that's out in the public. But as we know as researchers, a lot of what we say in public isn't actually what we think in our minds. So there's a role for us as researchers to get in and understand what's happening in our minds, and then draw that out of people, and then help use that in association with what AI can leverage as well.
Yeah, I've said this before, but I think if AI can answer your questions, you're probably asking the wrong questions. We should be asking questions that ChatGPT cannot answer for you. Maybe that's a good test, you know, do a search in ChatGPT before you put something in your survey. To make sure it's new knowledge.
No, and that's a very fair call. So hence the asset that we have in sample.
Right. Yeah.
So if I can quickly recap what we've talked about today. So we need to, as an industry, adopt a new approach to survey research, and that involves treating sample as a reliable asset and not just a commodity. So this will help us address the data quality issues that we've had. that have been growing as well. It'll help us to be able to draw out deeper, more representative insights as well, so we can actually make more of an impact for the businesses and to the consumers that we're doing this research on behalf of. We do need to deal with this, I guess, front on, try to front load the quality that's coming into our research processes, even though we have things like fraud detection and software, etc. That's just after the fact, so we want to try and catch it before it enters into the system. There are some things that have worked really well from a B2B perspective. So collecting a sample from say LinkedIn and social media. So that's had a lot more success of recent, I guess you could say. And we just need to try and match that into the consumer research space as well. We, I guess, need to move on from that sample as a commodity mindset with some slightly different research practices. We know that AI is going to impact some of this that we need to do as well. But we know that having smaller sample sizes, or even like trying to focus on that 95% of the population who don't answer surveys, can help us to get better representation and ultimately improve the data that we're getting there too. So ultimately, if we start treating people and being mindful of the experiences that we're offering sample, we'll get a more inclusive, more representative sample, and then better data and insights off the back of that. So I think that kind of covered it, Karine.
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. I guess the only thing I would add is that, ultimately the quality of the research depends on the quality of the data. And at this point, we have no choice. We really need to start prioritizing sample quality to ensure a sustainable and thriving industry.
That's right. And I think that's something that innately we do and we want as market researchers as well. So maybe it's just a bit more of a concerted effort to do so.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us on the episode today, Karine.
Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. And for the listeners out there as well, we'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the podcast, shared it with others, or even left a review. Thank you for listening to Now That's Significant.